Okay. Hello, everyone. This is the second episode of the Spectrum Spotlight, and today's guest is someone very special, someone who's written a book that has changed many hearts on autism. And this author that we have today is Dr. Barry Prizant. Dr. Prizant, you want to introduce yourself for the audience who hasn't, for those who haven't heard of you yet?
Sure. Greetings, everybody, and it's a pleasure to meet you all. Uh, just a little bit about myself. I am a speech language pathologist by training, but I always like to emphasize that I really got started working at residential summer camps for children and adults with a variety of labels of disabilities, if you will, and that was more than 50 years ago. And pretty much I have worked and dedicated my work life and my personal life to having friendships, learning from, and working with neurodivergent people.
Awesome, awesome. So the question I'm very curious about is what made you very interested in writing about autism?
Well, I initially was more academically trained, and so I did publish a lot of research. And going way back to my doctoral dissertation, where I found echolalia was communicative and important and really refuted Lovaas and a lot of the early behaviorists back at that time. But my recent book, Uniquely Human, A Different Way of Seeing Autism, really was my effort to share my experiences and how much I've learned from families, from autistic people, both children and adults. So it's a storybook, and I learn a lot from stories. I learn from listening to people tell their stories. As a matter of fact, I feel that our understanding of autism has changed much more significantly by autistic voices than by decades of heavily funded research.
I mean, I'm glad you brought up your book because I did want to ask what made you want to write it.
Well, I guess in a sense, my wife, she didn't make me, but but my wife said to me, "You share so much." When I do a consultation, we've been doing parent retreats for 25 years. When I spend time with my autistic friends, and in some cases their families, and I share what I've learned through stories. And my wife said, "You have so many stories. I think other people can learn from those stories as well." So my book's really a storybook. It's a book about people of all ages, of people who are autistic, people who are neurodivergent in other ways, their families, their personal experiences, their challenges, but also their successes. And I give a lot of public presentations, and people say, "We love hearing your stories." So about 10 years ago, my wife said, "You should write a book that's just stories and what you've learned from families and from people." And that's how Uniquely Human was born.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I was diagnosed pretty early, 4 or 5 years old, if not younger. And my mother remembers that when she would go to these workshops and presentations on autism, the general theme was it was not so much testimony from people on the autism spectrum, but it was a lot of statistics and it was very gloomy. And then people like you came around, people like Steve Silberman came around and started
Yeah.
changing perceptions on it. And now, as more and more autistic people are growing up and are able to share their stories, I think now the perception of autism being this devastating illness is starting to go away, that it's more complicated than that. So awesome. I also
If I could interject, it's starting to go away, but it's still too slow.
yeah,
It needs to be accelerated dramatically.
for
Yes.
sure. For sure, for sure. I totally agree with you. What would you say is the most interesting finding or finding that you found or bit of research you found while doing your book?
Oh, well, again, my most recent book, it is just kind of thinking deeply about my life and people I knew. And it enabled me to kind of go back to the early days in the 1970s, because my training is in child and human development, emotional development, language development, cognitive development, which very, very early on, put me in a very much a counter contradictory position to, the father of ABA and what was going on at that time. It just made no sense to me. So I think in a sense, the finding, in my book was kind of rehashing and having the ability to reflect on my life and the people in my life and how much I've learned, and how much we are all still learning. So I don't know if you're aware, but the book was published in a second edition that came out last year. And I included many, many more stories of autistic people who have become friends, who I work with, who I present with, who I write with. And so I guess from the first edition, which came out in 2015, to the second edition that came out last year, in that 7-year period, I realized how much more I continue to learn from autistic people and from families. And so that's a great motivation. And also what's happened that you may know in this time period is I developed a podcast called Uniquely Human, the podcast. And we just released our 83rd episode. And my co-host and co-producer is Dave Finch, who's an autistic audio engineer. And he's a very funny man. And he and I have become very close friends. As a matter of fact, we just did an interview together about an hour ago. And we've interviewed, of the 83 episodes, at least 2/3 of them are interviews with autistic people in all walks of life. People who are professionals, people who've just recently been diagnosed, often self-diagnosed, as you know, how common that is now. Many, many women who were late diagnosed because of the problems in identifying autism in women. So out of the book came this podcast, which is one of my greatest learning experiences. It's absolutely terrific. And we have terrific people, and we talk about so many different topics. Topics around issues that are challenging, co-occurring conditions. We had a wonderful interview with Kim Cleary, who's an autistic occupational therapist, who was misdiagnosed as only having an eating disorder for decades. So I continue to learn, and the book has been a springboard for more learning. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I've attended one of your presentations before. I believe we met in person many, many years ago.
Ah,
Have you ever visited San Diego?
yes.
Okay, then yeah, we have. We have met very long time ago on a panel, and I did get to share my own story. And it's so cool seeing you again here. And I know for certain I've met David Finch. He was at the same conference,
He was.
and yeah, yeah. So really cool. I've also invited him on to be on here because he had a lot to share when he was presenting last time at that conference. It was I believe it was the Love and Autism
It
conference.
was the Love and Autism.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
It's really cool to see you here again. And at that time, I was in barely entering high school, and now I'm in college now, my second year. So it's really cool.
It is
Um,
great to see you. Yes.
yeah. What would you say is the most harmful stereotype of autism, and how do you think we should combat that?
I think the most great questions. The most harmful stereotype, I think, is that I guess you could say, in a general sense, that autistic people just don't care. That they just don't care about other people. They don't care about learning. They don't care about things that neurotypical people say they should care about. Uh, I think one of the most harmful stereotypes, of course, which we addressed very early on, more than 20 years ago in our writing, was that autistic behaviors are just looked at through the lens of pathology, okay? Everything from stimming, so we wrote years ago about how self-stimulatory behaviors are often strategies to be well regulated, maybe an expression of excitement and high physiological arousal at the time that people were still punishing autistic people for that. I think in many, many ways, autistic people are terribly misunderstood. And in some cases, some of the most prominent, highly published professionals, especially in behavioral psychology, have perpetuated that misunderstanding. And we could go on and on that autistic people, don't have empathy, they don't care about people. And I think the way to combat it most effectively is for the neurotypical world just to hang out with and get to know autistic people, and get to see. I mean, that was my life and my experience. That, you're I find autistic people to be so honest, so sincere. I love the directness. I grew up in Brooklyn, in New York City. That's part of my culture, where you say what you mean and you're just very honest and straightforward. So I don't have any issues with that at all. I appreciate it, actually. Um, I think the more opportunities are created, whether it's in work settings or in school settings, for non-autistic people to hang out with, develop friendships with, and get to know autistic people, that's the best way to break the negative stereotypes.
Mhm. I agree. One of the things my school did, the elementary school I went to, was that they actually tried to remove my autism diagnosis, I guess, from paper, because they argued what you said. Used to, like, some people argue that the reason I didn't care about school or socializing was because, or rather, that the reason it wasn't that I had autism, it's just I just didn't care about people. I didn't care about school. Of course, that's total baloney. But yeah, that was an argument they tried to make, and unfortunately, that did set me back a lot. Now, thankfully, I had a very great mother who fought against that and got me into a school that's very accommodating for people like me. But yeah, I do agree. That is a stereotype that does need to be fought back against, because it's just talk to the average autistic person. It's just evidently wrong that we don't care about socializing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in some ways, we just had Elaine Hall on, who's neurodivergent, not a diagnosis of autism. She has an autistic adult son. And she's from LA. She's the founder of the Miracle Project, which is a theater and expressive arts program for neurodivergent as well as neurotypical actors and people who want to do that. And she says, how much she was misunderstood. And she's really come to an understanding of her neurodivergence only very recently. But how much her son, it's an adopted son, has been misunderstood. I think, if I write another book, I think the title would be Misunderstood. I mean, it's just, we have to correct people's understanding and the lens that they look through when they look at a person who may do things that they don't quite understand why it's happening. And luckily, I mean, it's all of you folks who are really trying to write the course. And that's what we hope to do with our podcast. And it's become a cliche, but it's amplify the voices of autistic people who have the lived experience so that the rest of us can learn. And in many ways, as a neurotypical person, for whatever that means, it helps me to be so much more self-aware of, in some cases, similar challenges. And I don't believe in this concept there's a little bit of autism in everybody. I don't believe in that at all. But we do have experiences that could help us, if you will, have that perspective taking and understanding that, I'm sure you've heard of the double empathy piece, where people thought, oh, autistic people can't empathize with neurotypicals, but wait a second, probably even more so, neurotypicals do not take the perspective of autistic people
Mhm.
and their experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say has been the impact of your book?
Oh my goodness. Another great question. it has been so far beyond what I ever expected. Um, Let me give you some examples. Parents of a newly diagnosed child saying, "Oh my goodness, your book gives me the courage to trust my intuitions and to push back against people who say we have to fix your child, okay? Or we have to make your child non-autistic." All the way to individuals in their 50s and 60s who have written to me and said, your book was so respectful, helped me understand myself better because of your experience. I'm corresponding, for example, with a man who was in a federal penitentiary. And he says, I am guilty. I had pictures of naked kids on my computer. He's there because of child pornography. And he said, your book, you know, kind of tells me why I did those things and why I was confused, but I'm not a bad person, you know? And he actually said to me that he's in a group, a support group for people where he is who are in prison due to so-called sex offending charges. And he feels that about half the people are probably undiagnosed on the spectrum. Because what they were doing, they didn't see as bad. They didn't see it as necessarily any kind of bad intentions at all. It's very, very sad. We interviewed Nick Dubin, an autistic man who had been in prison for the similar reason, and now he teaches other people on how to be aware of those things. So, and then the joy. So many autistic people and so many parents say, thank you for pointing out our strengths. Thank you for pointing out our what we call enthusiasms, what many people call deep interests. Thank you for respecting that, because other people see that as strange, and it's a lifeline for me that leads to a better quality of life when I could do what I love to do, and other people can appreciate, whether it's music, whether it's art, whether it's collecting certain things, whether it's having great knowledge about certain topics. So the range of reactions has been just absolutely tremendous. Let me share one. On Amazon, there are many reviews. If you go to the Amazon page for my book, many, many reviews from autistic people, from parents. The latest review was from a grandfather. And he said, thank you for your book. It helped me see my 4-year-old grandson as a courageous human being, that given all of his challenges, he tries so hard, you know, he keeps trying. And, you know, again, the cliche, sometimes he falls down, but he gets himself right back up again. And those are the kinds of reactions to my book that really make me so happy. It changes the lens through which people see, understand autistic and neurodivergent people.
All right. Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And that story was really tragic. Yeah, a lot of innocent intentions from people on the spectrum get misunderstood. I think one story I can think of is there was a autistic man at Disneyland wanted to touch the princess's like clothing. He liked the fabric,
Yes.
and the people that played the princesses would let him, but then there would be people that would pass by and say like, "You're a pervert. You're a weirdo. Like, stop being weird." Now, of course, the workers at Disney who knew him did defend him. Like, they knew his intentions. They knew what he was thinking. But yeah, unfortunately, yeah, a lot of that is super hard. Um, so hard to digest. What do you think the experts have gotten the most wrong on autism?
A number of things. One of them, I've been very involved in initiatives trying to change perceptions of non-speaking autistic people. So, you know, in our culture, unfortunately, the greatest factors that people look at in determining how quote unquote intelligent a person is, whatever that means, tends to be spoken language skills and your traditional measured cognitive abilities. And we've interviewed 3 non-speaking people on our podcast to date. We just interviewed Elizabeth Bonker, who was a valedictorian at her college last year. She's non-speaking. And I think that that's one group of people that not only has been left behind, but continues to be left behind. So that's one of the greatest misconceptions and challenges. I think the thought that autistic people, because they may behave differently or process kind of information differently, that so many opportunities, especially in employment, are just shut off. Except for those settings, and they continue to be rare settings in some corporations where people say, well, there are many autistic people who have, pretty amazing skills in this area. So let's make sure there's a good match between what they're good at and, the job placement. I always like to say, just in general, for all people, the happiest people are those who are able to do a lot in their life what their brain is designed for them to do. When there's a good match between your brain wiring and what you could spend your life doing, whether it's in employment or whether it's with other people, with a hobby, anything from music to art to science, and we know it varies greatly across autistic people, then not only does it create opportunities, but it allows other people to see you as a full and competent, if not an exceptionally competent, talented human being. And I think that's really important.
Hi, I have
Absolutely.
a question. Was there any negative pushback when you released your book?
Interesting. It's a great question. The negative, there was very little, very, very little. And there continues to be very little. So I'll say, and it sounds like I'm bragging a little bit, but along with Unmasking Autism, it's the most highly rated book on Amazon right now, and it's been the best-selling book. And so many autistic people have thanked me for that book. In the first edition, which was written more than 10 years ago, I used person first language. And so some pushback came from some autistic people. Actually, one woman said, don't read this piece of crap. I couldn't get past the introduction, okay? Because he uses person first language. A lot of autistic people came to my defense and said, read the whole book, damn it. It's and of course, and this is to be totally expected, a little bit of pushback, not too vocal, but less than I expected from ABA people.
Mm,
Because I give a lot of examples
Mhm.
in the book
mhm.
where, I talk about, from my personal experiences, the abuse that I saw on autistic people in ABA programs. So but overall, the reaction to the book has been far, far more uniformly positive than I ever expected.
Yeah,
And I'm so grateful for that. Yes.
and that's
That is
great.
phenomenal.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have less than a minute left for this episode, but I'm going to end the meeting here, the recording. But thank you, Dr. Barry President, for joining us today. We're going to move on to the Q&A session now, so I'm going to have to exit this link and open it again. I hope you don't mind.
No, and thank you so much. I appreciate it, David.
Of
I'll
course.
yep.